the walls of the formerly abandoned House of Writers. Whenever I mentioned to anyone in Sarajevo that I was conducting research on the culture of anti-fascism in the city, I consistently received responses from general public that reflected their deep knowledge of the topic, as well as people tend to have strong opinions about this subject. It was striking to me because it's not the case in Kazakhstan. I remember as a child, for example, with my grandmother, when we passed by memorials or attended annual Victory Day parades, we talked about anti-fascism, the war, struggle against fascism. Also, as children, when we played shooting games, we used fascism as an F word to insult each other or triumphantly yell and war-related words in German, such as Hitler kaputt and the Hoch. But all of this remained in the past, and the memory of anti-fascism is not there anymore in Kazakhstan at all, probably, I would say. So my initial guess was that Bosnia and Herzegovina was directly affected by war as it was occupied in 1931 by the Axis powers. Well, okay, Kazakhstan was not occupied, but still the country made a significant contribution to the fight against fascism with 1.2 million Kazakhstanis mobilized for the war effort, resulting in the loss of more than 600,000, including my direct relatives, my grandparents, and including 125,000 ethnic Kazakhs. It led me to question, which became kind of introduction to the writing process of my dissertation. Why has anti-fascism been preserved in the collective memory in Bosnia and Herzegovina, playing an important role in the daily lives of the participants in my study, while in my home country, despite its significant role in the anti-fascist struggle during World War II, this memory is almost non-existent. In general, it appears that World War II is getting less visible in collective memory in Kazakhstan. The Victory Day has not been celebrated for the past 5 years, and our president rarely attends Victory Day parades in Moscow. The significance of the war, well, we always used to attend these parades in Moscow in the past. The significance of the war appears to be diminishing with a growing alternative narrative suggesting that for Kazakhstan, it was a conflict fought on the side of one colonizer against a potential other colonizer. This emerging perspective has led me to consider the differences between the studied cases regarding the significance attributed to the memory of anti-fascism from a decolonial perspective. Both Kazakhstan and Bosnia and Herzegovina can claim pre-modern forms of state, but they were able to realize modern nation statehood only after the 90s. Both cases share an imperial legacy, with Kazakhstan having been ruled by Russian Empire and Bosnia and Herzegovina by the Ottoman Empire and later Austro-Hungarian Empire. Additionally, both share a socialist legacy as they became considered a minor subject within the larger communist federations following the collapse of their respective empires, Soviet Union and Yugoslavia respectively. So I employed a decolonial perspective to demonstrate how the knowledge of anti-fascism in both countries is constructed differently due to their distinct post-colonial and post-socialist context. I argue that neither Kazakhstan nor Bosnia are fully sovereign states, but both find themselves in a neo-colonial condition. Both lack autonomy. However, Kazakhstan, while still significantly affected by Russia, is able to legitimize the state, including by nationalization of World War II memory, while not openly confronting Putin's memory politics. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, the situation is less promising. It became a protectorate in the context of Dayton Peace Agreement following the war, which established a dysfunctional and paralyzed state in which my participants have no hope for a promising future and as such look for normality and modernity in the past, with anti-fascism being central to their identities. So, I will now talk about Kazakhstan and Bosnia separately. Kazakhstan. Anti-fascism has been a significant constitutive element of post-World War II political ideology in ex-communist states. The narrative of victory over fascism has been central to legitimacy of socialism in Eastern Bloc. This narrative was imposed from above, directly from Moscow, leaving no room for interpretation of the war or the anti-fascist legacy. With the decolonial break after the fall of the Berlin Wall and breakup of the Soviet Union, formerly dependent nations achieved autonomy and opportunity to shape the memory of these events. The opportunity, however, was limited. In some cases, countries still received this autonomy, and in case of Kazakhstan, not. For example, Baltic states and Poland were able to achieve full decolonial break with the communist past and promoted a narrative of totalitarianisms, equalizing fascism and communism. To be honest, in case of Kazakhstan, it will be a fair judgment of the history because, for example, in the 1930s only, due to collectivization and industrialization policies, almost half of the Kazakh population died, and our intelligentsia has been completely exterminated within 2 years. However, we cannot afford to promote such a narrative due to multiple reasons, such as likelihood of aggression on behalf of Russia, as an open decolonial shift may lead to it, as demonstrates the case of Ukraine, for example. This is why decolonial aspirations in Kazakhstan are complex. We should take into account the huge proportion of ethnic Russians living in Kazakhstan, the world's longest overland border with Russia, and our big neighbors' broader geopolitical interests in the region. So, within the framework of importance that Putin gives to the memory of World War II and anti-fascism, we should be always careful about how we interpret our past. So how we do it? For instance, the case of 28 Pamphilov Guardsmen. It was a regiment that was formed primarily in Kazakhstan, who are known for their heroic defense of Moscow. When they ran out of ammunition and more soldiers died, the remaining 28 soldiers defended the capital by standing in front of the enemy with arms spread wide and chest open. This famous monument can be found in Almaty in Kazakhstan in the park named after the regiment's commander. Of course, it's a myth. It was debunked, but due to the fact that World War II remains highly politicized, such Soviet symbols of war-related heroism and sacrifices are still promoted and can be found on the pages of history textbooks. However, it should be mentioned that despite Pamphilov was neither Kazakh nor born in Kazakhstan, the continued valorization of his division's presumed act of bravery is portrayed as national pride and devoted to heroism of Kazakh soldiers rather than related to Soviet army per se. So Kazakhstan's commemoration strategy can be described as a careful recasting of Soviet heroes into symbols of Kazakhstani statehood in the framework of state legitimization, advancing a national narrative while maintaining diplomatic relations and avoiding direct confrontation with Russia's memory politics. While anti-fascism, seen as an post-Soviet ideology, falls outside the scope of state-sanctioned memory. In this process of selective remembrance, anti-fascism is erased. Unlike in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where the lack of clear future due to its neo-colonial condition ensures its persistence. Anti-fascism in Bosnia and Herzegovina holds a distinctive place in historical, cultural, and political consciousness of its people. In Bosnia, anti-fascism is primarily considered as a period of pride and urgency, unlike in Kazakhstan, where it was imposed from above. In Bosnia, it was a grassroots movement that symbolizes a collective resistance to fascism. Drawn from interviews conducted in Sarajevo, I explored the collective resistance to fascism. Drawing from interviews conducted in Sarajevo, I explored the unanimously positive representation of anti-fascism in Sarajevo, particularly among youth, who increasingly identify anti-fascism as a core part of their identity. I argue that this reflects their disillusionment with the unfulfilled promises of neoliberalism and the bleak political reality imposed by the Dayton Agreement. The war that took place in Bosnia and Herzegovina between 1992 and 1995 ended with an agreement signed in Dayton in the US. The Dayton Peace Agreement and its Annex 4 is the current constitution of Bosnia and Herzegovina. However, it did not end the war, instituting a fully sovereign state. Instead, it resembles an international protectorate imposed through a top-down approach. The Office of High Representative, which is composed of foreign observers, became central authority directly affecting the politics of the country. The main issue, however, is not that international actors took a significant role in Bosnia's internal affairs, but the political system that the Dayton Agreement put in place. While pursuing the goal to bring an end to inherent ethnic hatreds, it was assumed by the creators of Dayton that the best way would be to give equal representation to each ethnic group, such as by dividing the territory across ethnic lines, having 3 presidents representing each, as well as dozens of ministries with equal proportion of each ethnic group. As a consequence, the noble goal created a dysfunctional state. As my respondents claim, the state cannot function because there always has to be a consensus for any decision to be proceeded, but it is impossible in such a complex and divided political system with, for example, 14 ministries of education only. Most importantly, the Dayton Agreement contributed to a loss of hope with respect to any political change because it created a status quo where the rule of nationalist and corrupted elites cannot be challenged. Under normal conditions, while competing for the positions in power, such as elections, for example, political campaigners try to win over electorate and attract voters by distributing collective hope. They need to make promises appealing to their electorate and take responsibility for keeping their promises to a certain extent. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, such incentives are unappealing to the elites because they are certain of winning any electoral cycle. The idea here is that the main nationalist parties representing Bosnian Muslims, Croats, and Serbs are confident that their respective populations, to a larger extent, would keep on voting along nationalist lines within the Dayton framework, irrespective of what kind of policies they promote, whether they are corrupted or not. In this scenario, anti-fascism provides my interlocutors with a moral framework for opposing what they perceive as a moral, divisive nationalist politics of Dayton Bosnia. One of the main reasons why my participants refer to anti-fascism is because they believe that Yugoslavia was a more just regime in terms of respecting people upon their merit, and as such, anyone who deserved it could live a normal life, having a job, apartment, and travel both within Yugoslavia and across Europe. It is believed that there was a greater economic stability, personal freedoms, and state autonomy, elements that are now missing. The youth in Bosnia and Herzegovina thus seeks modernity and normality in this historical period as a counter-narrative to the failed promises of the present. Thank you. Oh, it was clear.
What's
the presentation?
Oh, yeah.
I did not see it.
That's okay. So do you have that set? So make sure whenever you speak, it has to be very close, they said. All right. So next we have Jelena, who is going to present to us the memory of anti-fascism in Serbia and the post-Yugoslav space between criminalization and appropriation.
Thank you. I'm just going to check if this is working. Yeah. Okay, so today, as my title says, I will be talking about the memory of the anti-fascist struggle in Yugoslavia, so the People's Liberation War, as it was officially called, in the post-Yugoslav space, where I will be particularly focusing on Serbia. And here I'm focusing predominantly on official memory politics and dominant discourses in society, and I will provide an overview of kind of the history of the memory of anti-fascism. When I was thinking about it, what to focus on today, I decided to provide an overview, and then if we have time during the Q&A, we can talk about some other things, because in addition to working on the official memory politics in post-socialist Serbia regarding collaboration and resistance, I was particularly interested in the far-right and right-wing anti-communist memory from below and conducted fieldwork. But this is not something I will be talking about today so much. So, looking particularly at post-socialist Serbia, as I said, we can recognize two dominant lenses, I argue, of interpretation of anti-fascism that always inform the official politics of memory. And they also reflect the broader post-Yugoslav and post-socialist context, of course. And these are anti-communism as probably the more dominant one, and ethnicization or nationalization of anti-fascism. And my paper today focuses on the politics of war memory in Serbia since the early 90s, and then also identifies, in addition to these two dominant lenses, kind of three phases of reinterpretation of the Yugoslav partisans. And this is also how my presentation will be structured. So in Serbia in the 90s, we have the appropriation of Yugoslav anti-fascist struggle of the People's Liberation War by the Milosevic regime. Then, after his overthrow in 2000, a new phase comes of very strong anti-communist criminalization of the partisans as communist perpetrators and rehabilitation of their war enemies, as well as invention of new anti-fascists out of these wartime enemies of the partisans. And then, since 2012, or maybe even a bit earlier, and until today, we have the re-emergence of really large-scale militarized celebrations of anti-fascism again. And before I move on to the post-1989 period, which is the topic of this conference, I will provide a brief intro also to the Second World War and Yugoslav culture of remembrance, which was also also help Nicola to save some time, I guess, for more important things. So, but before that, also the themes that this presentation revolves around are based on my research. First, the book that I published in 2020 about focusing really on anti-communist historical revisionism regarding the Second World War. And then, as this second publication shows, I'm also interested in the populist revival and appropriation of anti-fascist celebrations. And I'm also more than happy to share the book with anyone who wants it in PDF. It's also on Library Genesis, just brief information. And also at the moment I'm not working on this anymore. I'm a historian, so I'm working on post-1945 connected history of anti-colonialism and anti-fascism, focusing predominantly on Yugoslavia and Algeria, but also looking at cases of former Portuguese colonies and Palestine. When it comes to the Second World War in Yugoslavia, this is a very brief overview that won't really do it justice, of course. It was a war of occupation and liberation, as in many other contexts, but it was also a civil war. It was also a socialist revolution that was led by the Communist Party, and as I already said, it was officially, and also by its participants, referred as the People's Liberation War. The communist-led uprising erupted in 1941, and it quickly spread across Yugoslavia. The movement also grew into a mass army by the end of the war, and here, what is very important to say is that also the partisans of the People's Liberation Movement was the only consistently anti-fascist movement in the territory of Yugoslavia, and which also saw itself and really talked about itself as such. Against partisans, there were many different collaborationist forces from above and from below, with different ideologies, different levels of collaboration. And in my work, I focused on the Chetniks because they became the main object of revision in Serbia after 2000. They were the royalist forces supported by the government in exile, and they were nominally in the first months of the war in 1941, resistance movement, and they had Allied support until 1943, which makes them very easy object of revision, obviously, but they also engaged in collaboration and war crimes very consistently. And at the end of the war, those who lost the war, so various collaborators and also enemies of the partisans, those who persecuted the partisans and their supporters, they faced punishment, which took form of executions and trials after the war. And the Chetniks also, those who did not flee the country, also faced punishment. And their leader, Dragoljub Mihajlović, was sentenced to death and executed in 1946. So naturally, the People's Liberation War became the main historical reference in Yugoslav society. It was the main legitimacy source of the regime. It was the birthplace of Yugoslav state socialism. And the partisans were celebrated as heroes, as martyrs, as revolutionaries, and the defeated political and military sources, collaborators, they were all equally judged as collaborators and people's enemies. And the war narrative was, I'm not going to go into detail about the Yugoslav memory culture here, but we can see that this war narrative was increasingly challenged in the public starting from the early 80s by various actors who were usually not historians. And they created a blueprint for later anti-communist revisionism that would become the official narrative after 2000. So now, the 90s. I'm taking a chronological approach. I hope that this is not too confusing. So the first multi-party elections in Yugoslavia brought the Socialist Party of Serbia, which was the successor of the League of Communists of Serbia, as they renamed themselves. The elections brought them to power, or they stayed in power, we can also say, and Slobodan Milošević became president of Serbia. And during this decade, the regime promoted itself as the guardian of anti-fascist memory. They commemorated anti-fascism, they celebrated it, they celebrated the Day of Victory and other memorial days, but of course the partisans were adjusted to the political context in the sense that they were depoliticized, so deprived of their communism. They were interpreted strictly as a Serbian movement, just like today, and this was very ambiguous memory politics where anti-fascism was kind of hijacked by radical nationalists and also used in war propaganda of the 90s, merged with the narrative of Serbian victimhood. And at the same time, the first commemorations of collaborators, such as the Chetniks, emerged in this decade among the political opposition, and that was very diverse but very strongly anti-communist. And the state did not endorse these commemorations, of course, but they tolerated them. And some of them became quite popular, of course. Rehabilitation of collaborators and fascists, as some of you might know, was also present in Slovenia, Croatia, for example, but also the symbols and images of the Chetniks, of the Ustaša, and so on also resurfaced during the wars in both Bosnia and Croatia, particularly among paramilitaries and in war propaganda. What I particularly focused on in my PhD research and the book was this anti-communist turn, as I call it, in 2000 after Slobodan Milošević is overthrown. In 2000, a democratic coalition comes to power that basically drew their whole legitimacy from the narrative of a democratic revolution and from the narrative of defeating the last communist dictator, as they referred to Milošević. They referred to him as such. And this narrative could also enable them to represent themselves as liberators of Serbia from communism and the first democratic rulers and so on. And these discourses that I mentioned from the 80s and 90s became the cornerstone of official memory politics. So in the first year, various references to socialist Yugoslavia disappeared from the public sphere, were replaced by the narrative of communist terror. Axis collaborators such as the Chetniks get rehabilitated, and partisans become perpetrators and are criminalized. And why the Second World War became the central object of revision is because, of course, it was the legitimacy source of Yugoslav state socialism that had to be dealt with as quickly as possible. And the People's Liberation War had to be radically revised. And in that process, the political elites were really searching for a resistance movement that was a resistance movement, but that must not be communist-led. And this is where the Chetniks come into picture as the ideal historical reference from the Second World War. And they were constructed not only as a true Serbian anti-fascist movement, not poisoned by ideology, but also they were also constructed as innocent victims of communism because they faced retribution at the end of the war. Needless to say, the Chetniks never used the word anti-fascism. They never referred to themselves as anti-fascists. This became the case particularly after 2000 in the official memory politics and kind of public discourses. And they were equalized with the partisans as well, but this equalization was only at a very superficial level and only apparent because at the same time there was a very strong process of criminalizing the partisans, as I said, as perpetrators, as ideologically unacceptable, as those who started the civil war within the Serbian nation in 1941 that could only be ended if Dragoljub Mihajlović, the Chetnik leader, is rehabilitated, as he was in the court in 2015. So I'm not going to, I don't know how much time I have, so I won't go into details about how this narrative exactly works, but if we look at the whole Second World War only through the lens of the post-war retribution, and if we ignore the wartime context, then Chetniks can become innocent victims of communism, because if you only look at the punishment that they faced and ignore the collaboration, the war crimes, and everything before that. And at the same time, partisans, of course, become perpetrators, and the anti-fascist struggle is criminalized. And at the same time, the purpose of all this is, of course, also portraying socialist Yugoslavia as inherently negative historical experience, again, looking through this narrow lens of the post-war period, the most repressive period of socialist Yugoslavia. And this image of the Chetniks was promoted in popular culture, media, in museums, publications, by revisionist historians and so on, but also through state-sponsored initiatives that resembled transitional justice. So as I mentioned, rehabilitation laws, investigative commissions searching for the graves of the Chetnik leader, then also changes to veteran laws, equalizing the Chetniks and the partisans. And also very important to emphasize is that there was a very strong anti-communist consensus in this period, and if we look at parliamentary proceedings and votes for and against various laws that would revise the historical interpretation of anti-fascism, almost no one voted against them. So even those who maybe would not admit that today necessarily. And this reflects broader processes in Central and Eastern Europe since the 90s, of course, where criminalizing the communist past usually comes hand in hand with rehabilitating collaborators, even if they were war crime perpetrators or also if they were involved in the Holocaust. But then another turn happens, and this is, no? Yeah. In this context of all-encompassing revisionism, suddenly the Serbian government decides to start celebrating liberation from fascism, not anti-fascism as such, but rather the victory and liberation. And I would call this authoritarian or populist turn, even though we can argue that any memory politics is always populist, because that's how it's supposed to work. If it works, it is populist. So this period in the last 15 years or so was marked by the appropriation of the partisans, really large-scale celebrations of the 90s wars, and constructing the narrative of the anti-fascist struggle, the First World War, anti-Ottoman uprisings, and the 90s wars all together in this narrative of the liberation wars of Serbia throughout history. And these celebrations of liberation of Belgrade and Victory Day started very small scale in 2009 after Kosovo proclaimed independence, as Serbia was counting on Russian support. But it becomes more prominent, more large scale, more pompous after the Serbian Progressive Party comes to power in 2012. And the very same state officials who voted for laws to rehabilitate Chetniks, who were saying that the revisionist memory politics wasn't enough, that it should go further than that, are now arguing that they are the guardians of the memory of anti-fascism, that they are the only in the region who stand against historical revisionism. And of course, they share absolutely no values with the anti-fascists that they claim to celebrate. And these commemorations are large scale, they are everywhere around Serbia, they involve enormous funds and efforts, but of course, again, similarly to the 90s, you will not see any references to the ideology that drove people to join the partisans, that drove the People's Liberation War. There is no mention of the revolution that followed, of state socialism that followed, multi-ethnic character of the People's Liberation Movement, or the socialist state that emerged from it. And we even see far-right groups marching on the Victory Day in memorial processions, and it is always also connected with the 90s wars. And here, Russia is also a key partner because there is a shared historical narrative and similar commemorative practices that are militarized. And these commemorations are used also to celebrate the friendship between the two countries. But I will conclude now. So I wanted, in this talk, to highlight the transformations of memory politics from socialist Yugoslavia to today's Serbia, looking at shifting interpretations of anti-fascism. And at the center of changing interpretations of anti-fascism are the partisans and the chetniks. Partisans from heroes who built the socialist society to perpetrators and illegitimate rulers, and then back to being celebrated as a Serbian army. Chetniks, collaborators and war criminals turn into true resistance fighters and victims of communism, today completely normalized in a positive light in Serbian society. And of course, what also David talked about in the spaces of leftist activism and private memories across the region that used to be socialist Yugoslavia, the People's Liberation War still serves as an inspiration and very important one. There's also, as I said, anti-communist memory community from below, and which can be far-right, right-wing, but also liberal or conservative, that commemorates the end of the Second World War as a tragedy. But I wanted to just kind of provide an overview of the official narratives because they do dominate the society. And finally, across the post-Yugoslav space beyond Serbia, whether the political actors criminalize the partisans or appropriate them, what is common for the whole region is, with all these transformations taken into account, is the erasure of the emancipatory and revolutionary dimension of the People's Liberation War. And it goes hand in hand, of course, with the physical disappearance and disregard for the Yugoslav anti-fascist memory culture that takes place parallel to this global hype surrounding the partisan monuments, which is equally depoliticizing and deprived of meaning as anti-communist memory politics is. Thank you.
Thank you, Jelena. So next we have Nikola, who will present his work, Historical Revisionism and the Crisis of Anti-Fascism in Contemporary Montenegro.
Thank you. First, allow me to express my sincere gratitude to the organizers for putting together this outstanding conference. And at the very start, I would not like to be understood as someone who attacks the revision of history per se, as it's sometimes a legitimate process, especially when positive tendencies follow it, or when the aim is an objective reinterpretation of some historical events, and particularly when it is supported by new historical evidences. Evidence that has, until now, remained unpublished. But I do have a problem with the brutal historical revisionism which is happening in Montenegro, and not only in Montenegro, but in the whole post-Yugoslav space. So I would like here to reminisce or to refer to the thesis of the Harvard professor Avezir Tucker, who distinguishes at least three kinds of historical revision or revisionism. The first one would be evidence-driven revision. The second would be revision driven by the significance of a historical event or historical figure, and by my modest opinion, that is where the historical revisionism started. And the revision driven by values of world views. Tucker further observes that among those revisionists who do not rely on new historical evidence, but instead use their ideological convictions and worldviews as the fuel of historical revision or revisionism, there are most often three shared traits. Denial of historical guilt, for example, Holocaust denial, or we can find similar denials, for example, in our region when we start with the Srebrenica genocide or similar genocides which used to happen during the Second World War and later. The second thing would be promotion of national self-esteem through national myths and appetite for conspiracy theories. In historiography, most often the tendency to brand every source, historical source, that departs from one's value framework as a historical forgery. And I believe that Montenegro is witnessing precisely this kind of historiographical reinterpretation, which profoundly affects the country's anti-fascist heritage, and I will try to outline it for you now. So, I will try to do a brief historical recapitulation or historical background. In 1918, Kingdom of Montenegro was basically annexed by the Kingdom of Serbia and absorbed into a unitary Yugoslav kingdom. Back then, society split into two factions, the Greens, which were anti-annexation oriented, and the Whites, which were pro-annexation or pro-unionistic oriented. And the Montenegrin government in exile gained Italian support until the 1920, until the Rapallo Treaty. And as you know, especially people from Italy, there were even some personal ties. A Montenegrin princess was Italian queen, Princess Jelena of Montenegro. She was a wife of Victor Emmanuel III. And as you can see on this photo, Montenegrin or representatives of Montenegrin government in exile appeared even on Mussolini's March on Rome in 1922. So we can somehow follow the roots of the collaboration between that Montenegrin ideological line with the fascist groups or fascist forces, like from that very early period. And I will now try to go to the Second World War and Petrovdan Assembly, which was convened under Italian occupation, which deepened more internal rifts in Montenegro. So, for example, on the next few photos, you can see the most prominent people who attended that very Petrovdan Assembly. And you will notice on one of the photos, Sekula Drljević. He was a prominent Montenegrin politician and a jurist. And he is reading the declaration of Petrovdan Assembly. He's the bald guy totally on the right side, on the first photo. And you will notice as well the Metropolitan of Serbian Orthodox Church in Montenegro, Joannikija Lipovac, who was waiting through the celebrations for Pircio Biroli, the later governor of Montenegro, and he was as well the member of Petrovdan Assembly. As I said, it was assembly organized or convened under Italian occupation. And you can see both of them at one very special dinner which was organized after that very assembly. So the point is that within the declaration of that assembly, the Montenegrin independent kingdom under the protection of Italy was proclaimed. And what is interesting in this context, Sekula Drljević was basically a political symbol, personal political symbol of the Green movement, so anti-annexation or pro-Montenegrin movement, while the Metropolitan Joannikija Lipovac was the symbol of the white movement or the pro-Serbian core. So they were both together at this very assembly. And why is it interesting? Because what happened during the 90s, the Serbian Orthodox Church canonized, or I think in Catholic terms, beatification is the more proper term, this very man who was intensively collaborating with the Italian and German occupiers. And there is a bunch of photographs, video recordings. I found not only these few photos, but some additional video recordings at the archive of Institute Luce or Instituto Luce. I'm not sure if I pronounce it in a good manner. But you can see basically the icons of the Ioanniki Lipovac, the Saint Ioanniki Lipovac, Metropolitan of Montenegro. On the other side, here are the two publications which were issued by the Doclean Academy of Sciences and Arts, and that is some kind of a parallel, because we have one official Academy of Sciences and Arts in Montenegro, which is called Montenegrin Academy of Sciences and Arts, and it is like the most prominent scientific institution in the country. But during the period of fight for the Montenegrin independence, one political core decided to establish another parallel Academy of Sciences and Arts, which would be more pro-Montenegrin than the Montenegrin Academy. So it is like an antipode to the original Academy of Sciences and Arts, and that very academy was celebrating this guy, which is called Sekula Drljević, and they reprinted or republished a couple of his books, and these two publications are the most explicit one where you can notice this kind of glorification of the Sekula Drljević only because he was, in political terms, fighting for independent Montenegro. So, like, on the basis of these two persons, you can see, like, that some kind of historical revisionism started in the early 19th by the Serbian Orthodox Church, but after 1997, when the Montenegrin government decided that the Montenegrin independence should be a state-sponsored project, they tried, and I can say that they continue to do so in the next 15 years, to reinvent some of the heroes of that very idea from the past, and they have found people like Sekula Drljević, and not only him. For example, I mentioned Serbian Orthodox Church as one of the most prominent propagators of historical revisionism in Montenegro in the 90s. And for example, here is the publication. It's in Cyrillic, but I will like translate it. It's like Hell or Communism in Montenegro. It was like published during 1943 by the newspaper's Voice of Montenegro, which was like directly edited from the Italian offices in Cetinje, occupying offices. And the Serbian Orthodox Church reprinted that publications. And you can like find that publication during those years like in every small shop in Montenegro. And I think that they printed it in a couple of thousands copies or 10,000s of copies, etc., which is like a good number for Montenegro because we are a very small country. We have only 600,000 people. When I said that Metropolitan Ioanniki Lipovac and the Sekula Drljević were not only symbols of that kind of historical revision, I was mentioning, or I was thinking about these two guys. The first one is the Chetnik leader of Montenegrin Chetniks, Pavle Đurišić, and the leader of Lovćen Brigade, Krsto Popović. And I will try briefly to inform you about the constellation in Montenegro during the Second World War, although Jelena explained it in a beautiful manner, and especially she explained the nature of the partisan movement and the Chetnik movement, and it was pretty much similar in Montenegro, right, like in the rest of Yugoslavia. So basically the only anti-occupying forces in Montenegro were Yugoslav partisans, while the Chetniks and Lovćen Brigade, or these two leaders who were on the top of this hierarchy, were actually collaborators with Italian and German occupying forces. Serbian Orthodox Church started to rehabilitate the Pavle Đurišić by publishing a numerous number of books, because after the Petrovdan Assembly in 1941, the first reaction, or broader reaction in Montenegro, was the 13 July, so-called 13 July uprising. And it was more or less non-ideological uprising. It was not like pro-communist or pro-royalist or something like that. It was like a broad uprising, and what is paradoxical, this guy, Pavle Đurišić, was the part of that uprising. But after that uprising was basically destroyed by the Italian forces, Pavle Đurišić became a prominent collaborator of the fascist forces and later Nazi forces in Montenegro. While this guy, the second guy, and I will put the accent on him during my presentation, Krsto Popović, was from the very start, he was not a part of the 30 July uprising, and he was a very persistent collaborator, and basically his Lovćen brigade was some kind of paramilitia, Italian paramilitia, so he was basically serving occupier from the start until the end of the war. I would just like, before I go to the Krsto Popović case, I would just like to mention so-called Chetnik revival in party politics, because we have a paradox that, or maybe it's not a paradox, I'm not sure, that, for example, part of the current government in Montenegro is New Serbian Democracy. So as I said, it's the part of the ruling majority, and it displays overt Chetnik symbolism. For example, the leader of this party holds the title of Chetnik Duke or Vojvoda, when you translate it into Serbo-Croatian, and some senior figures have proposed the building of monuments to this Pavle Đurišić, and on this photo, Pavle Đurišić is standing with the Pircio Biroli, the governor of Montenegro, in one North Montenegrin town. And the current mayor of Nikšić, which is the second biggest town in Montenegro, is often photographed with Chetnik symbols, Chetnik insignia, and so on and so on. But I do not have time today, unfortunately, to list examples of attempts of historical revisionism and the rehabilitation of the Chetnik movement in Montenegro, because those attempts, at least to date, have not been sufficiently effective in Montenegrin public life. One other Montenegrin collaborationist movement, however, and its leader in particular, and this is the Krsto Popović, have, in my view, been de facto rehabilitated in Montenegrin public opinion, despite the indisputable evidence pointing to their quisling role and to the war crimes in which they took part directly on or indirectly. I would, therefore, in this case, draw a distinction between de facto and de jure rehabilitation. For instance, Jelena did not mention that, but in Serbia from 1992 until 2019 existed the de facto rehabilitation of Milan Nedić, the former head of the puppet government in Serbia. Nedić, even until recently, had a street in a couple of Serbian towns, for example, Aranđelovac and so on. And there was one very famous play directed by Siniša Kovačević. A play was named General Milan Nedić, which was performed at the Zvezdara Theater, one of the most prominent Belgrade theaters, for over a decade. And even it was broadcasted on the Serbian national radio television. In a very similar fashion, Montenegro treats Krsto Popović, despite the earlier mentioned fact that no first-class historical source has in the meantime emerged that would refute his collaboration or the war crimes for which he bore common responsibility. Regarding the revisionist historiographical line on Krsto Popovic's role, it is in substance of a distinctly hybrid character, and I will try to explain this. This historiographical line, which tried to rehabilitate Krsto Popović, holds a strongly positive view of the partisan movement, 13 July uprising, anti-fascism. Yet, it stubbornly tries to insert Krsto Popović into that framework of values, though, as the evidences are showing, he does not belong to there. And when I'm saying that there is a bunch of evidences, for example, these are like some periodicals from the period of Second World War, where you can explicitly see the numerous numbers of, or examples, better to say, of collaboration of General Popović. So, for example, if you go to the archive, for example, this is the title, in Montenegro, there is no place for the partisans, and there is a glorifications of the Popović brigade and so on and so on. And if you enter into the archive of Yugoslavia in Belgrade, you will find as well a bunch of archival sources which are proving not only the collaboration but the war crimes of the Popović army forces. So these are just examples which are basically which you can find in different archives in former Yugoslavia. I would like to continue to explain how the case of Krsto Popović has been treated after the 2006. Naturally, such an understanding has been broadly compatible with something which I mentioned before, and it is state-building narrative, which was launched in 1997, and it was intensified in 2006. So it is noteworthy that, for example, the historical or historiographical line, which I was mentioning before, which is promoting the idea of rehabilitation of Popović, finds certain Montenegrin communists kind of suspicious, solely because they had a different view of the Montenegrin national question, since for that historiographical line, anti-fascism basically is an important but still secondary value category, while the primary value category is the struggle for Montenegrin independence, equality and national distinctiveness of Montenegrins. So that is why they think that, for example, some Yugoslav or Montenegrin communists were suspicious. Why? Because for that state-sponsored narrative, it was kind of hard to reinvent Montenegrin partisans because they have fought for the Yugoslavia, for the preservation of Yugoslavia and the federal state. While these guys, which were basically collaborators, were like pro-independent in that ideological or political sense. So, for example, what they reproach or how they treat, for example, one of the most important or most prominent Montenegrin communists, Milovan Đilas, it is not that they interpret him as suspicious because of his potential leftist errors, but his altered view on Montenegrin national distinctiveness. And it is not only the thing with Milovan Đilas, it is with Sava Kovačević and other communist heroes and anti-fascists. So for the said historiographical line, these individuals represent the so-called white faction of Montenegrin communists or white communist serfdom. And that is like the moment where they are like in some kind of a political conflict with that kind of political tradition. So when it comes to the revision of history regarding Krsto Popović's role in World War II, the main promoters of glorification of his role are certain religious, scholarly, and cultural institutions. For example, Montenegrin Orthodox Church. I forgot to tell you that or to explain that. Like we have in Montenegro two Orthodox churches. We have Serbian Orthodox Church, which is the most influential religious organization in the country. So the predominant part of the Orthodox population are the followers of this church. And we have another antipode or parallel institution in Montenegro, which is Montenegrin Orthodox Church, with which has like significantly less followers, but still it's maybe something like 10 or 15% of the Orthodox population, while like 85% are followers of the Serbian Orthodox Church. But still it is relevant, even 15%. So, for example, Montenegrin Orthodox Church is organizing a large memorial services, which in our language we called it parastos or parastoses, and I think this word has a Greek origin. And for example, the very same thing the Serbian Orthodox Church is doing with the Chetnik leaders in Montenegro, like Pavle Đurišić and so on. So you have like two versions of parastos for like these very collaborators from the Second World War. For example, I mentioned Doklian Academy of Sciences and Arts, as well as many media outlets, political actors, and even state bodies. Ambassadors, municipal presidents, and mayors have attended and spoken at memorials dedicated to Popović. And, for example, the Ministry of Culture supported the television monodrama The Confession of Krstozano Popović, which was written and directed by Blagotaj Raković of the State Theatre Zetski Dom, and with actor, prominent Montenegrin actor Slobodan Marunović. This monodrama has been broadcasted several times on the Montenegrin National Broadcaster or Radio Television of Montenegro, and as I said, and I will repeat it, it was supported by the Ministry of Culture of Montenegro. So I will now summarize, or at least try to summarize, most common revisionist arguments. So historians which are trying to rehabilitate Krsto Popović in our history books, in a bunch of papers which have been published in the last 2 decades or 3 decades, is that Krsto Popović did not take part into Petrovdanski Sabor, though this is irrelevant. For example, one famous partisan general, Savo Čelebić, did participate, yet immediately joined partisans. That Popović and his forces felt animosity towards the Chetniks, refused to take part in Bosnian operations on Neretva, and condemned Chetnik crimes against Muslims. Although the relations between these two groups were indeed fraught with tension, mistrust, and hostility, but what undeniably united the Chetniks and the members of the Lovćen Brigade was collaboration with the occupiers. Despite all mutual antipathies and differences, Popović in 1942 agreed on the basis of an accord with Pircio Biroli that Chetnik General Blažo Đukanović should be appointed as a commander-in-chief of all national units in Montenegro. One must not forget that in December of the same year, Popović sent Đukanović a letter inviting him to, I quote, brotherly settle the foundation for the renewal of our old Montenegrin harmony, the end of the quotation. So the next argument would be that the majority of Popovic's men ended up in the partisans, but what is a prominent fact is that a large number of Domobrani, which was like a Croatian home guard during the existence of independent state of Croatia, and fair number of Chetniks of younger generation also ended up in the partisans at the end of the war. The next argument is that the Italian occupation was the most human occupation in the history of all occupations, and that idea is used further to absolve Popovic's role. What is particularly emphasized is the significant role of Krstozano Popović during the Christmas uprising of 1919. That was, I'll make just a short digression, the uprising which happened after the one assembly in Montenegro proclaimed annexation of Montenegro to Serbia. And after that, this very Christmas uprising happened, and one of the most prominent figures of that uprising was the Popović. Of course, there is no doubt that his stance in some earlier historical events, I'm speaking about Popović, were honorable and consistent, but just consider, Philippe Pétain was a great hero of World War I and for that he received the rank of Marshal of France. Dragoljub Mihajlović was a hero of the Balkan Wars and the World War I. Pavle Đurišić, which was mentioned before, was participant of the 13th July uprising. Yet none of these absolves them of the war crimes and collaboration with the occupiers. I believe that the different rules cannot apply to Krsto Popović either. And I would like to finish now just with one short video, which lasts like 3 minutes or something like that. It will be a bit funny for you because you don't understand Serbo-Croatian, and there are some like really theatrical moments. But you will just see like really explicit examples of some kind of de facto rehabilitation or normalization of the personality of the Krsto Popović in contemporary Montenegro. So I would like the people from the backstage, if they can. I will try to translate some important parts. This is the monodrama, which was supported by the Ministry of Culture and which was broadcasted at the radio television of Montenegro. This song is basically saying that Krsto Popović was a knight of Montenegro, a knight of Montenegro, a hero of Montenegro.
Jesam li ja to mrtav? Ovdje samo moj duh što luta crnom korom.
U Art dnevniku i jedno podsjećanje. Danas se navršava 67 godina od pogibije Krsto Zrnova Popovića, jedne od najzanimljivijih ličnosti novije crnogorske istorije. Njegovo mjesto u nacionalnoj istoriji tumačeno je tokom različitih vremena na različite načine.
This is like a memorial TV show about the death of Krsto Zrno Popović on the national broadcaster, national television of Montenegro.
O životnom putu Krsta Popovića, njegovim idealima i uvjerenjima za televiziju Crne Gore govori
They're speaking about his life path, his heroic struggle for Montenegro and so on.
U Art dnevniku samo dio iz intervjua.
Cetinju je obilježena godišnjica pogibije brigadira Crnogorske kraljevske vojske i vođe božićne pobune.
Another memorial which was organized by the Montenegrin Orthodox Church. I mentioned before like that religious procession which we called in Montenegro, and not only in Montenegro, in the region, Parastos. And this religious procession is organized for the memorialization of the deaths of some famous people. And this is Metropolitan of Montenegrin Orthodox Church.
Mislite li da ste kupovino ne ljudi, propalih ljudi kupili crnogorski narod? Ludo se varate. Crna Gora je gora Crnogoraca. Tako je bilo i tako će biti. Krsto Popović je ostavio ogroman trag u crnogorskom narodu, ne samo u svojoj
Metropolitan is currently glorifying the role of Krsto Popović and how much he was important for Montenegrin nation.
uzdizao čast i slobodu crnogorskog oružja.
Veče posvećeno Krstu Zrnovu Popoviću organizovali su Matica Crnogorska,
This is the night which was dedicated to Krsto Popović, which was organized by the Matica Crnogorska, official cultural institution of Montenegro, which has been supported financially by the government of Montenegro. And this is the mayor of Cetinje.
Ali siguran sam da u njegovoj naravi riječ žrtva nije postojala, bar ne u značenju kako mi je danas.
And he is of course having a speech where he is glorifying him. Mayor of Cetinje is this is the football match of Montenegrin football national team. And do you recognize the face of the guy on the stadium? On this flag there is a face of Krsto Zrno Popović, and you can hear Montenegrin national anthem. imagine flag of face of Mussolini on the stadium of Italian national football team. Again, songs about Krsto Zrno Popović and so on and so on. You can end now with the video, it's enough. And there is a bunch of such examples you can see in the Montenegrin media. Thank you for your attention.
All right. So I want to give a couple of maybe thoughts and comments, just thinking about some of your work and how it overlaps. And then maybe what we can do is open it up to everybody in the room. One of the things that stuck out to me as I was listening to all of you is maybe going back to sort of the questions that we were listening to in the opening ceremony, is thinking about these definitions of what is fascism, what is anti-fascism, and sort of one of the comments that really stuck out to me that Jelena was talking about was memory is populist. And I thought that was really kind of a fundamental way to sort of frame maybe some of this. Is, so if in all three of your cases you're dealing with anti-fascism, which is integrated into the way that, we'll say, the communist world legitimated itself, right? So in some sense, as communism comes down, in some sense we have this re-emergence of anti-fascism as having to be redefined apart from communism, right? And so I think this is really fundamental. So my research is in Spain in the 1970s and 80s, and the ways that young people use anti-fascist culture to push back against 40 years of fascism. So in some sense, you're coming at this from an opposite direction of what I typically have been thinking about it. So I really appreciate that. And all the words that were kind of coming back into your vocabulary that the three of you used were rehabilitation, reinvention, legitimization, all words of thinking about rebranding. And that's what historical memory does in some senses. It rebrands how we've been thinking about the world and trying to make it useful again. So whenever we see these reemergence of terminologies that once would have been anti-fascist, they can become nationalist again through this idea of memory. So, and thinking about Jelena's comment about memory as populist. So anti-fascism is reintroduced and popularized in a different way, which means that through that populism, the memory can become more nationalistic. And I think that's sort of where some of your questions are, is how does this anti-fascism become nationalistic or traditionalist in some way, and then how is it neutralized in other ways? And I think that's one way to kind of maybe think about some of these anti-fascisms and fascisms, is that they're overlapping with each other in strategies, right? It's not just that the anti-fascism has to be rehabilitated. It has to be rehabilitated in a way that is populist, and that populism runs the danger of becoming traditionalist or of becoming nationalist. And I keep thinking about this terms of what is anti-fascism? Well, it should be simple, anti-fascism, right? What is fascism? That's where everybody has these historical debates. Is fascism something that ended in the 1940s, or is it something that continues on? I generally believe, like other isms, fascism, feminism, socialism, communism, liberalism, can continue on. Isms change different branches, but they still exist in different forms. And I think maybe that's one of the ways we can think about these changing anti-fascisms, is that while we might have had a certain type of anti-fascism in the 1940s, what we start to see is anti-fascisms that change over decades. And so by the time we reach the 80s and 90s and 2000s, anti-fascism has to carry more weight than it did in the earlier versions. And I think this is one of the ways that I'm really starting to think about maybe not just anti-fascism, but fascism itself, is that the branches, they sometimes overlap and they sometimes get abused and used. And this is where the sort of question of historical memory comes back in, is historical memory is, it can be done in these ways that you talk about with the Tucker example of how history can be used, right? It can be simultaneously a method that you're using evidence to, and et cetera, no? But also, historical memory is how we try to reclaim the past to be able to use in the present. And what we're seeing with all of your examples, I think, is the breaking of narratives, the reconstruction of narratives that are mixing both the academic and the popular, right? And I think this is where a lot of the history needs to kind of go with the sort of thinking about memory and public history, is that it can't just be academics in one part of the world talking about this. It has to really start to mix these other ways that we're thinking about historical narratives. And I really appreciate how you bring this to the sporting event at the end, right? Because that is where this is, again, bringing it, whenever you said it's hard to believe Mussolini would be on the cover of a football match, and both Jelena and I were laughing because I could imagine that, right? I could easily imagine that.
I said Italian national football team.
Italian, I could imagine that, the Italian national football team. I could imagine a world where nationalism, because what is a sport where nationalism still exists? And I can imagine it for Real Madrid in Spain. But I think these are the questions, is where are the battlegrounds of this ideology, right? It can exist on television, it can exist in education, it can exist in the football field, but it can still penetrate our world in a way that I think is ongoing. And so I just want to maybe open up with the question for all of you is, how do you see not just anti-fascism re-emerging in, we'll say, the even more contemporary world, so the last 10 years, but how is it combating fascism in its current form to bring it back to where we are today? I think that's sort of the last little gap I see in all of these conversations, is the most recent 10 years.
Should we
Yeah.
open Q&A or?
If you could answer that, and then we'll open to the Q&A.
Okay. Well, I did not mention it, but as you said, nationalization of anti-fascism takes place everywhere in the region, in Bosnia and Herzegovina specifically, because there are 3 ethnic groups and each nationalizes anti-fascist memory with the goal to promote their national narratives. And my anti-fascist participants are, on the contrary, trying to fight against these 3 regions. However, I would have to say that it's also a revision in a way, because it's overly positive, because anti-fascists in Bosnia, Tito's partisans, they also committed crimes, but never has this been mentioned by my participants. For example, towards the end of war in 1945, Tito's partisans killed from 20 to 70,000 people nearby Bleiburg city in Austria. This memory is not promoted by my anti-fascist participants. So there is this problem as well. In terms of defining anti-fascism, primarily, I have never received any definition, but what unites them all is a shared belief in common values. And the second point that unites them all is a connection to Yugoslavia. So anti-fascism in Yugoslavia, in Sarajevo, cannot be really separated from each other.
Which again brings back that nationalism question, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, Sarajevo, it traditionally is a multicultural city, so for them anti-fascism is an anti-national sentiment.
When you ask how the anti-fascism is combating with something which is like postmodern fascism or fascism, contemporary fascism, whatever. It's such a tough question because I think it's combating on a very low level, especially because you can see a strong correlation between like political elites, nationalism, at least in the Balkans, but you can see it like all around Europe and not only in Europe, and something which I would call like some kind of latent fascism in different shapes. For example, I just want to share with you one interesting moment which I saw 2 days ago. So I don't know if you heard about it, but in Croatia there will be organized the hugest concert probably in the history of Europe. I think that you maybe heard about Marko Perković Thompson. It's the guy who is like some kind of, I could not say that he is some kind of neo-Nazi, but he is like a guy who is promoting the ideas or the values which were promoted back then in the time of the Pavelić independent state of Croatia, which was a puppet state as well, as you know. So on the YouTube you can find like Thompson's interpretations of old Ustaša's song and so on. So he will organize a concert in Zagreb, and I think that he sell over 500,000 of tickets. And I was watching the interview with the president of, listen to me very carefully, president of Social Democratic Party, which is kind of leftist party in Croatia. And the journalist asked him, will you go to the Thompson concert? And do you know what he said? Well, I'm not sure, I don't know if I will have time to visit his concerts and so on. So he isn't even brave to say explicitly that he don't want to go to the concert of some at least right-wing musician or singer. So, because he could not do it because of his voters. Because a bunch of SDP voters will probably be on this concert because, I mean, he sold more than 500,000 of tickets. So, you know, like you can see it in our region, you can see it in Central Europe, you can see it in USA, unfortunately. I mean, look what the Trump is doing right now. So that very strong kind of correlation, as I said, between political elites, like contemporary nationalism, and from my point of view, latent fascism is for now too strong, too much strong for the, I don't know, social movements, anti-fascist social movements in Europe or in the world whatsoever. So that's my impression. I mean, it's a tough question. So
I'll try to be very brief because I want to leave time for discussion. I will limit myself to the Serbian case. I think this is for the last maybe 13 years, there has been a complete ideological and overlapping narratives as well between the ruling parties and the political elites and the far right. I think we haven't seen that for a very long time, and I think it is also quite similar to the US, but at the same time, all these people are commemorating anti-fascism. Before that, many of us were so politically socialized in some various local anti-fascist groups that drew on the legacies of the People's Liberation War, because this is the historical reference that you base your activism on, and half of your activism is about fighting the historical revisionism that comes from everywhere. But now, the far right is celebrating the victory against fascism, and so this is very confusing, but at the same time, the far right is legitimized in the sense that the narratives about the 90s wars, the very aggressive Serbian nationalism of similar to the 90s, this is what they share with the political elites, and this becomes then much bigger problem in society than when it is like neo-Nazis of the 90s, which are very marginal groups. This is now a much bigger problem in society, and I think this is where we can really see parallels between the US, Serbia, Hungary, various other countries that don't have shared historical experience, but when it comes to this overlap in the narratives that are dominant in society and the far right, yeah. And this is very dangerous. And I'm not going to say something about combating it because I don't know.
Thank you. If we can open up, if anybody has any questions. We'll start in the back and then we'll come up front.
Thank you so much for your interesting presentations. I have a small question. So first comment, I work a lot on fascism, anti-fascism in Southeast Europe. I can add that there is the same going on in Kosovo. Sorry.
Okay. That there is the same revisionism going on in Kosovo, also with Javadeva, who is also like a Nedic war criminal, and it's so interesting that all these very far-right nationalist movements use the same manner to push their voters to the right. And my question is, it's more personal. How were anti-fascist anarchists remembered, or aren't they? I mean, today I know that after they were coming back, for example, from the Spanish Civil War to Southeastern Europe, first included in the partisan army, but then also pushed back. And how are they remembered today? Or aren't they?
I could talk a little about Bosnia, because when I encountered these young anti-fascists and at their place of gatherings, this DKC center, it felt to me that they're a group of anarchists. And I was constantly looking for this answer. No one identified as anarchist, because in Sarajevo, anti-fascism is related uniquely to communism rather than to anarchism. So in the case of Sarajevo, no, it's not there.
Buonasera a tutti. Stavo pensando che c'era uno scrittore italiano che mi immagino che in sala lo conoscono, è Gabriele D'Annunzio, che diceva che io non l'ho mai apprezzato, per carità, era un depravato e impossibile ma scriveva molto bene. E diceva che l'ignoranza è la grazia e sapienza del popolo. Mi viene in mente che sfido la sala a sapere che noi alla fine della seconda guerra d'indipendenza, 1866, abbiamo occupato la valle del Tagliamento e la valle del Natisone. C'erano dai 16.000 ai 18.000 sloveni, censiti dall'esercito austro-ungarico. Abbiamo iniziato subito a massacrarli, non potevano dire la messa in sloveno, li abbiamo massacrati. Nell'isola di Arbe, che è praticamente in Dalmazia di fronte a Venezia, che i croati chiamano Rab, avevamo fatto un campo di concentramento fino a 11.000 persone, ne abbiamo fatti morire più di 1.000, tra i quali più di 100 bambini al di sotto dei 5 anni. Questo, italiani brava gente. Mi viene in mente che prima parlava del calcio. Faccio una domanda, scusate un secondo, faccio presto. Faccio una domanda al volo. Prima parlavate del calcio. Se in Italia mai durante una partita della nazionale potrà esserci un qualche foto di Mussolini? C'è già. A Reggio Emilia ci sono 2 gruppi ultras, le teste quadre e il gruppo Vandelli. Uno di questi è organizzato, ve lo dico perché lo so, è organizzato da un tale che si chiama Gigi. Io ho parlato con lui e gli ho chiesto: ma Gigi, ma tu non sarai uno di quelli che va a festeggiare il duce, il compleanno del duce Predappio? Certo che ci vado, ha detto certo che ci vado, quindi state tranquilli, Reggio che è una bella città, progressista eccetera, siamo messi così, quindi non c'è da meravigliarsi se fra poco, anzi, non so chi di voi ha preso l'ultimo libro di Scurati, è dedicato agli antifascisti, è dedicato a quelli che hanno a cuore la libertà. poi dice ci sarà da lottare molto. La domanda era che già nel calcio abbiamo già dei gruppi, siamo già messi bene, come dice Bersani, siamo già molto avanti con i lavori. Siamo già molto avanti.
Well, I just have to admit that I'm not a huge football fan, so probably that's the reason why I don't know about these facts, so sorry because of that.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions over here?
Thank you. Just one remark on the way in which we understand anti-fascism. You raised the question of definition, right? You correctly said fascism, okay, anti-fascism is anti-fascism. What do we mean with fascism then? And you said fascism is like communism, liberalism, and other ideologies still continue to play a role in our political thought, also fight and conflicts. Okay, but fascism is a different kind of ideology because it's not really an ideology. It's not articulated like the other ideology. They didn't have the time to articulate a full ideology of fascism. That's why Umberto Eco, as was mentioned today by Corsini, talked about the category of Urfascism, which is a collection of, sentiments, attitudes, in a confused way, talk about fascism. But even if we agree on a definition of what is fascism, then we don't know what is anti-fascism. Because anti-fascism, first of all, is not like I don't agree. It's fighting against fascism. It's not only be negative, but fighting against fascism. And second, as been demonstrated also today, people can fight against fascism for different reasons. Because they are communists, because they are liberal, because they are nationalists, because they are something, okay? So they feel the meaning of anti-fascism with their own struggle and collective identity. Starting from this, when you mentioned Jelena thinking about memory as populism, right? She said, not memory is populist. When it works, it's populist.
I didn't say memory, I said memory politics.
Memory politics,
So
when it works, right?
Not really, I mean, it aims to work, it aims to be
It
populist.
tends to work, but the meaning is that because it's linked to the creation or recreation of a collective identity, otherwise memory politics wouldn't have sense, right? In strategical point of view. So that's why I don't understand why you said that in the last turn, the populist turn, the memory politics of anti-fascism is becoming depoliticized. If memory politics works, it is politicized. It repoliticizes the anti-fascism in a different way. It builds another identity. It's not a communist identity, it's not a revolutionary identity, it is a nationalist identity. It's linked with state building and nationalism building, which is politicizing something. I mean, I don't know if
I said that the partisans have been depoliticized in the sense deprived of their communist ideology and commemorated as a Serbian army that just decided to fight to liberate the country on the way to liberate Europe from fascism. In that sense, simplified and depoliticized the partisans rather than the anti-fascist memory. Which of course doesn't mean that there is anything depoliticizing about the this phase of memory politics as it is. Maybe I wasn't clear.
Do we have any other questions? Over here and then in the back.
Yeah, so I was thinking about, given this kind of situation in which there's the rebranding, there is this kind of uses of the past, the rewriting, revisionists, there's essentially, and also the history of the communist dictatorship after the war. So anti-fascism essentially is impossible to use as a language of opposition. So what is the language of opposition against, let's say, the depriving of real democratic structures that is taking place in so many places? So what are the languages that can be used if this is clearly almost impossible to use, right? Because also you mentioned that there is no linkage with anarchism that could be a counter to communism, right? A different kind of tradition of opposition and critique of structures of oppression. So what is it that in these societies provides, right, a language of opposition?
Do any of you want to take that on? Or I can.
Well, if I understand good the question, like, for example, this kind of opposition, at least in Montenegro, and I could say in the region as well, is a serious minority. Like, we have a situation that, like, political position or ruling parties or coalition, whatever, and the opposition as well have their revisionist optics bothly. So the both sides have some kind of revisionist approach. Doesn't matter if it's like this person or that person. And there is a small opposition which is predominantly academic. It is like surrounded with like some NGOs which are like indicating or saying that this kind of wrong historical rehabilitation is happening. But political elites really doesn't care. Of course, they will use this or that narrative to accuse the other side, like you're doing historical revision, but they mostly forgot that they are doing the same. It really depends who is in the position of the ruling party and who is not. So I think that we talked about it like in the meantime during the break, that we have a paradox right now that like some nationalists or even some former revisionists are now promoting, for example, like partisan movement or anti-fascist movement in the region, and that is really happening. And you have like that hybrid momentum when they are in the same time promoting anti-fascist values and doing a historical revision for their political purposes. So it's really hard to define what is like a position, a proper opposition towards these tendencies. So yeah, at least that's in the region of former Yugoslavia. I could not speak about the outside of it.
I think maybe one thing I would add on, just thinking outside of that, is in the United States case, for example, the word Antifa has become a derogatory term used by the far right, right? Antifa means equality. Antifa means caring about social issues and the welfare of workers. Antifa means feminism. Antifa means all these things. And so at some point, at least in the United States case there, they can't use the word anti-fascism the same way as they would have been able to in the past. And I think partly that's because in this interlude of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the word fascism became unclear to the public, right? And so what was fascism becomes unclear. If you can't talk about that in that context, how do you talk about anti-fascism today, right? So it still comes back to that same problem where, because we were so hesitant to call anything fascist, or we called everything fascist, that now when we're trying to use it in a more specific way to talk about maybe contemporary fascisms, it becomes useless because people don't know how to use that anymore. And so that's the challenge I think that we're dealing with.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that Trump said that Antifa is a terrorist organization
Yes.
in one of his
Multiple times.
speeches in previous mandate.
Yeah. Up until, so Trump does call Antifa a terrorist organization and has threatened to label it as such in the United States, which it sounds crazy, but it doesn't, because if you yourself are fascist, maybe you don't want to call or have something anti-fascist there, because to you they are the terrorists. It makes sense in his logic.
Just add, like, I think I understood also your question a bit differently, but basically what I talked about this period after 2000, where the anti-fascist struggle, the People's Liberation War, was very radically criminalized. This didn't take place, of course, only in Serbia. We see it also in Croatia and Slovenia. The fact that this is why I always say it was a communist-led anti-fascist struggle rather than communist anti-fascist struggle, because there were anarchists, of course. There were people who joined for different reasons, who had different visions of the society that would come later. And the fact that it was communist-led, for me, it does not delegitimize it at all. I think this is still a valid position, and this is not only my personal opinion. And also, interestingly, I had it on the slides, but I didn't want to waste time on it. Various right-wing, conservative, liberal actors across the post-Yugoslav space download these EU memory frameworks about anti-totalitarianism and various memory practices from across Central and Eastern Europe, and use them as role models, because if this was a communist anti-fascist struggle, this was that led to dictatorship. This was totalitarian, and that's why it is not legitimate. And there are still a lot of people, activists, intellectuals, and so on, who very strongly stand against this position. Because the purpose of this narrative is to delegitimize anti-fascism, to delegitimize People's Liberation War, and whole decades of Yugoslav state socialism that were not for everyone at all times exclusively a negative experience, and for many social groups also were very emancipatory, more than probably before in history. So yeah, for me, I think this is still a valid position. And also, like, anarchist groups also refer to the People's Liberation War as source of inspiration for their activism against the far right, because again, communist-led doesn't make it strictly communist and top-down and illegitimate.
Yeah, I could add, because I'm coming from Kazakhstan, ex-Soviet Union, I also found it a little bit complicated. I just couldn't realize how people could fight for the rights, fight against racism, homophobia, everything else, but at the same time be communist. For me, it was incomprehensible from the Soviet Union. But in the Balkan region, it's a little bit different. And my participants of the study, for example, claim that they were more free in Yugoslavia than they are now in Bosnia. So for them, there is no this incongruity.
Can I just add my experience, which I had at one conference? I mean, I want to say that I'm not a communist, but it was like an interesting situation, because one Slovenian priest, and he is at the same time a professor at one of the Slovenian universities, was like having his presentation, and he said, you know, like everything was happening in the Budapest, and he said, you know, you all in Central Europe like destroyed the communist monuments. You know, like after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the developed countries, the Central European countries and so on, did it. But in the former Yugoslav countries, we didn't do. We still have the monuments of the partisans, you know, like communist heroes, blah, blah, blah. And do you think it's logical? And I just asked him a question, like, okay, could you just imagine if you destroy all these monuments? Which monuments which symbolize the anti-fascist struggle would stay, for example, in Slovenia? If you would destroy all the communist monuments or the monuments which were dedicated to the communist heroes. And do you know what was his answer? Oh, here is the provocator. So, and I was like, okay, I'm a provocator, but can you just tell me? So we have a specific situation in former Yugoslavia that basically the only anti-fascist movement was a partisan or communist movement. So when we speak about that in terms of anti-fascist struggle, we cannot say that we had some kind of a liberal, I don't know, intelligentsia, or I don't know, some broader liberal movement or non-communist movement which was at the same time anti-fascist. Of course, there were some individuals which were non-communists, but they are like, how to say it, on the margin, basically. So that's the reason why sometimes it's hard to understand the former Yugoslav perspective on this very issue. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have time for another question back there.
Thank you. It is not a question, just a short comment emphasizing what Jelena said several times. This distinction, which I think it is important, the distinction between related to the memory policies in post-communist states to the anti-fascism, that these memory policies restricted the positive readings of anti-fascism to only sovereignty struggle for independence, for nationalist struggle, and stripped anti-fascist struggle from all this that you said, emancipatory, revolutionary, international, anti-colonialist, and so on perspectives of anti-fascism, these dimensions of culture that exist in the anti-fascist struggle, and it remained only, again, I repeat about Central and Eastern post-communist Europe, again, only positive only if it is against the occupiers. So it became something, anti-fascism became in this memory policy something very poor in quality. It is only some of the things that are related to sovereignty, to national independence, as many times in history before. Nothing new, in case when it is positive. Otherwise, it is only, as everyone knows, mercenaries from Moscow and so on, anti-fascists. So this is something related, I think, to the whole region, not only to former Yugoslavia, but to all the other countries, including Poland and so on. Thank you.
I think we have time if there's one more question, but I think we're good. No? Okay. Well, thank you all for coming, and let's go get coffee or a drink or food. Thank you all. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you for the comments.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it's really